Hello, everyone. This is Claudio Murgan, the host of the Spiritual Inspire Show. And my guest today is Rak Razam, who is a mythic storyteller, a screenwriter, author, journalist, filmmaker, and public speaker. He's been on a 20-year, well-documented journey on the fringes of consciousness that he's willing to share with us. Rak understood that collectively, we have the pieces to the puzzle of a healthy, sustainable, meaningful new paradigm that unites ancient wisdom with future technology. A thread through the labyrinth of disinformation and division that points towards home. For 10 years, he led an alternative podcaster with his show In a Perfect World. In 2014, the critically acclaimed documentary adaptation of his ayahuasca book, Aya Awakenings, was released and toured Australia, the UK, and the USA. This, in turn, led to his current documentary series, Shamans of the Global Village, which looks at the resurgence of medicine people around the world, working with psychoactive tools for community healing and alignment. Rak lives in Australia, in Melbourne, Australia. Rak, thank you for coming to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Good to connect.
While I start my research on you, I was pleasantly surprised to find out that the foreword for your book, Aya Awakenings, was written by Dennis McKenna, who also was a guest on my show. He was quite hooked on plant medicine. So how did you get him to write the foreword?
Well, Dennis is a friend I've known for about 14 years or so. We actually sat together in ceremony in 2006 when I was on my virgin trip to Peru to explore the archetype of the shaman and what the ayahuasca culture was all about. And we sat, I think we sat with Guillermo, one of the sort of more renowned curanderos of the time. And I met his then teenage daughter, Caitlin, as well, who was in on that ceremony. So I interviewed Dennis, and I've interviewed him many, many times over the years. And, watching his legacy unfold, his connection to his departed brother, Terence, who has left us for, I think, just over 20 years ago this month. I think it was the anniversary. And to a large degree, Dennis, even though, he's not Terence, Dennis is his own man in his own mind, his own soul. Dennis has bridged the worlds of science and the respectability that the science brings around plant medicines and around consciousness. And, Dennis has sat in hundreds, if not thousands, of ayahuasca ceremonies. He's done the hard yards as well. So he really is a good spokesperson for plant medicine and for healing and for that connection, planetary intelligence. So, yeah, I've known Dennis for a very long time, and when when my book was being reprinted, Aya Awakenings by North Atlantic Books in 2014, he kindly wrote the introduction for me.
Yes, we had a wonderful interview. During your trips to Mexico and Peru, you tried both 5-MeO-DMT and ayahuasca. And, while Aya takes you into a 4 or 5 hour journey, 5-MeO-DMT, it's shorter but much more powerful, much more intense. But both deal with, the personal default mode network. It vanishes, it makes it disappear. How would you characterize the effects of both being similar or totally different in terms of the transformation of DMN?
Well, I mean, they are probably the two most prominent entheogens, in culture at the moment. And there's a lot of difference between them, a lot of issues. And just to start off, essentially in general, in the last decade or so, with modern neuroscience doing legal tests on psychoactives, they have ascertained that there's this regional cluster at the back of the head of the brain called the default mode network. And it actually, it's sort of the channel of reality we're on when we're at rest or in default mode. But it is getting incoming sensory information, and it aggregates into this sense of this sense of reality, I guess. But one of the interesting things is that in tests with, LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, other things like that, from my understanding of the science, they actually noticed that even though each psychoactive was affecting the default mode network, each substance would have a little bit of a regional slight variation on the bits it was doing. Overall, it would do the same thing, but they were having slightly different effects. The neuroscience in 5-MeO is a lot less than the other substances. It's posited that, yes, it is affecting the default mode network as well. So when consciousness is freed up, so our perception of reality in this channel of the default mode and what we're doing, when the default mode network is lowered, or there's a more elasticity by psychoactive substance, our consciousness can essentially, in my interpretation, it can change channels. It can go to different frequencies of consciousness, which are out there in the full spectrum of consciousness, and with which indigenous cultures, the anthropological Western term for the understanding of altered consciousness in indigenous societies is polyphasic, in the sense that they understand that there's a multiplicity of states of consciousness beyond just waking consciousness and asleep, or being drunk, or mild body somatic stimulants. There's all these different channels of reality, essentially, that in the spectrum of consciousness that we don't normally in waking life encounter. But many indigenous cultures have been caretakers of psychoactive medicines, have it very much ingrained, embedded, and integrated into their worldview that the world is more than the reality you see in normal waking life. And so these substances lower the default mode network and allow consciousness to inhabit different frequencies of the full spectrum. But essentially, the one key difference with 5-MeO is that your sense of I, the sense of ego, the sense of identity is in an altered state. It's maybe traversing into very visual realms, into a sense of feeling like it's in a different space, but you're going into a different space. With 5-MeO, the sense of I, or ego, or identity is the journey. And some of the neuroscience is pointing towards the fact that 5-MeO is also lowering the frontal lobes and the parietal lobes of the brain, where at least partially they think the sense of ego and identity reside. So, I came across this little fact in research when I did a talk the other month. Freud, when he never really used the term ego. In the early 20th century, ego wasn't a big term. But in Latin, it basically means I am. It's the I, it's the sense of I. And so this sense of I with 5-MeO, when the geographical regions of the brain which are contributing to the sense of I and ego and the identity coming together, when that sense of identity is lowered, as well as default mode network, it's not that you're just traveling into another realm. It's your sense of I is revealing that you're not what you thought you were. So 5-MeO is the most powerful entheogen probably we know of to obliterate, at least temporarily, that sense of I or identity. And psychedelics in general have been coined ego dissolvers, in the sense that they lubricate that that stagnant or that centralized sense of ego, that here we are navigating through the world, but we're doing it is this identity of us. And when it's loosened, we can have an expanded awareness of reality. But then when the sense of I is fully extinguished, which 5-MeO has the ability to do temporarily, we reveal what's behind the I, what's behind the identity and the sense of consciousness. So, experientially, they're very different. Ayahuasca can be very visionary. It has the NN-DMT usually in it. Some tribes use 5-MeO in their brews as well, but traditionally it's the chacruna as an admixture plant to the Banisteriopsis carpi vine. And it can be very cathartic. It can be very long-lasting hours of ceremony. It can be very visionary, and it's purgative usually, and it can be really cleaning you out physically as well as on other levels. With 5-MeO, if it's from organic sources like the Bulfalvarius toad, or maybe some plants like Phalaris or other plants which may contain 5-MeO, if it is smoked, it's usually very short lasting, like 5 to 15 minutes. And, it's also that we contain 5-MeO within us. We contain NN-DMT within us as well, but it's metabolized by the body and it's kept at bay, so we're not in that state all the time. But there's some of the differences overall. But I think 5-MeO, for me, it has a key to it. It's like a key to consciousness, because we produce it ourselves, and it's revealing what's behind the mind. It really feels like it's a training wheels for mastering our own ability of consciousness and to drop into the deeper reservoir of source consciousness that lies behind the ego. So I think, you know, in some degrees, I think all the plant medicines are training wheels that really nature makes them psychoactive, but nature made us psychoactive, but we've forgotten how to access it. So all of these plants, with, you know, great respect to the plants and the caretakers of the plants, they're very much pigeonholed in the Western culture as tools that can relieve stress, anxiety, PTSD, trauma, and that's just the byproduct. You know, really what they're doing is they're showing us that we can open up into our own multidimensionality, and we can have a larger experience of what consciousness and life really is, and that we have these chemicals within us. And with modalities like breath work, meditation, and through the grace of God, you can access these pathways yourself.
Yes, and in fact, I watched your experience on doing 5-MeO DMT in Mexico, and it was honestly, it was very funny watching that experience. I mean, you're recording through the shamans of the global village, and it was interesting to see your reaction to the medicine. Anything you can share with us about that experience, because it was crazy. Honestly, it was unbelievable.
Yeah, so if people want to check out shamanstheglobalvillage.com, we do have 2 episodes, one with peyote and one with the Buffalo Various Toad. And, you know, we made a documentary film about adaptation of the book Aya Awakenings and my experiences in Peru with ayahuasca. But, you know, a week into my first journey to Peru, I experienced 5-MeO DMT in a smokable synthetic form with a Western shaman in Peru. And so that was really the backbone to the Aya Awakenings film as well, which is on aya-awakenings.com. And so it's always very, it's very sacred on the inside. It's a very intimate moment. It's an interesting thing filming medicine experiences. And over the years, I've had many people that want to do that when I've been involved with retreats and medicine work, you know, in Mexico and countries where it's legal. And, you know, I say to people that you can't capture what's on the inside. I mean, it feels so profound on the inside. And there is something of the Western sort of social media, Instagram, consume reality and get a snapshot vibe about trying. And yet, that is what I did, and I still do with the show Shamans of the Global Village, but it's delicate work. And so, you know, the experiences in the Bufo episode of Shamans of the Global Village, we traveled down to the Sonoran Desert, and we were led into ceremonies with the Seri tribe, one of the indigenous tribes of Sonora that are in the geographical region of the toad and have been reintroduced to the medicine. And, you know, we filmed some ceremonies working with the medicine, and they're very big. They're very loud. I mean, there can be very much catharsis. People can scream, they can cry, they can purge, they can turn blue. I mean, it's depending on dosage. I mean, one thing about the first episode of Shamans of the Global Village is it was really my virgin trip. I mean, I'd done Toad a few months before with Octavio Redig in Australia. But still, we were really learning about the culture and learning about the toad and learning about the medicine. And really, Octavio is sort of renowned for giving large doses as well. The Mexicans really don't measure it per se. They really go more intuitively with it. And so some of the footage in that is maybe indicative of large dosing, or you could maybe say overdosing. But for me, you know, I wouldn't say I was overdosed, but for me, it's just an incredible challenge to sacrifice your ego, your sense of life. Like when people say things like ego death, right? And remembering the ego is I am, it's the sense of I. And with all the medicine work we may or may not have done, and for me over the years, I'd had like at least a decade of ayahuasca and, you know, other entheogens work under my belt. But 5-MeO was still at that time the most challenging experience I could do. So there was fear. There was definitely fear. And there was definitely a sense of, you know, the first half a dozen times I did the Bufo 5-MeO toad medicine, my mind and my ego was resisting. It was like in fear of dying, because no matter how much it's explained to you by your facilitator, the context of the experience, that it's temporary, that, you know, it's like your ego is diminishing and lowering, and it's like this oceanic ocean is revealed within of interconnection to the unity field, to the source of all things. Beautiful, beautiful words. When you feel it, and when you're on the edge of there's nothing but white light, and it's not just that you're in white light and you can't see, but it's like energetically and emotionally you're getting saturated with like telepathic information from the source of all things, and you're being encouraged and invited to dissolve into it, and essentially ego death. Yeah. And, you know, so there's an internal mechanism where it's like you feel like you're dying. And so there's legitimacy of fear, because fear is the mind killer. Fear is in the mind, but it's asking you to open your heart. And at some point you have to surrender, or you're in resistance. And it's perfect whichever way you do it. But, you know, if you can surrender to it, there's that invitation to become it. And so that is, it's the biggest thing you can do and come back. It's essentially an ego death experience. And so, you know, Shamans of the Global Village has some outrageous footage, I would say, you know, of the ceremony on Shark Island with the Bufo toad. And still, you're really only capturing the outside flesh bodies, and it looks very intense. And there's screaming, and there's catharsis, and there's, you know, rolling around in dirt. But over the years, I've had to question, what is that all about? And I really feel that a lot of the external catharsis that you might see on YouTube videos for the Bufo or various toad, it's the ego, myself included. It's the ego resisting or riding that wave of obliteration. And sometimes if there's enough mind there, sometimes it can be joyous. It's not just that it's fear. Sometimes there's this ecstatic joy which overflows into sound, into screaming, and into yesing, and into like, you know, extemporizing the feeling that's on the inside. But essentially, that's what it's all about. It's about the feeling you're feeling on the inside. And, you know, it's ego dissolving, but it's not just that you're dying, it's that you're actually being sort of reborn, in the sense that you're connecting to what's underneath, the wireframe underneath of reality, underneath the material world, that source consciousness which has created and incarnated into becoming everything. That pool, that great ocean of being, is what you're invited into. And for me, it was, you know, it's the most profound experience I've had, is the 5-MeO experience. And I don't feel that it's finished. I feel that the geography that it has revealed is the real secret. That unlike all the other entheogens which are external to us, that we may partake of in a safe and sacred shamanic ceremony, this one is also within us. So one of the things that can happen with people's 5-MeO experiences is that it's not uncommon that people have what we call reactivations, that, you know, the 5-MeO is in their bodies, the pathways are revealed, the mind is lowered, and that we're learning how to access our full potential. And that this is not something you have as a peak experience. This is initiation you have to start you on the path of that internal geography, which you know exists after you've had this experience. It's not just in a textbook or ancient religious holy book. It's something which is alive and is in you. And if you nurture that relationship, I believe it can change everything. If the collective critical mass of people that have had a 5-MeO experience could access their internal 5-MeO pathways, then that would create a change in consciousness in the collective of the species.
Yes, it's important to connect with our own soul. And as you mentioned, 5-MeO is more palatable, let's say, than taking ayahuasca, which, you know, taste-wise might not be for everyone. And again, the length of the experience is different. So yes, 5-MeO might be a different or a shorter way, a shortcut, if I can say so. You know,
it might be, you know, what we're seeing now in the let's say the marketplace, the spiritual marketplace of Western culture, the overseas lodges and the shamanic underground is there's a sort of a smorgasbord approach to entheogens, which is really that it's like, you know, people are offering retreats where it's like ayahuasca and cambo and bufo and, you know, and they're trying to cram in so much that that's not the point. I mean, originally in many of these cultures, these things were used for healing. They're used for reconnection. And it might have been a historical geographic reason why they only use this one plant. But you've got to ask, why are we using these substances? And, you know, what we're seeing in the psychedelic community, which I make a sort of distinction between the shamanic or the entheogenic community and the psychedelic community, in the sense that psychedelics are essentially, not just that they're made in a lab, is that they're increasingly being commodified by venture capitalists and the modern psychedelic movement, which has really been fighting for 30, 40 years to bring these substances back into the Western medical model, is succeeding. And now as it's succeeding, big business is coming in on the back of, you know, legalization of marijuana in America and psilocybin's on the ballot in states in America. And there's big money who are seeing the potential of these substances as drugs, as in the Western sense of the word, in the medical establishment. And, you know, like $6,000 for 3 MDMA sessions under your insurance plan is great that is available. But if these substances are only used in the medical establishment for treating the anxieties of a culture which is trying to kill us slowly in the global battery farm of consciousness as everything hits the fan in the global emergency, they're not going to really make a big difference in terms of the awakening of humanity. And, you know, the shamanic medicines have a potential to do that. There's issues about regulation and safety and ethics and sustainability, but still they're outreaching to perhaps a larger portion of the Western community because, you know, they can. But the thing is, we're still in some senses treating them like the psychedelics. You go to an experience, you go to a lodge for a week, maybe you go to a retreat in Peru for a week, or you do a weekend or a one-day session, you know, with a facilitator on the shamanic underground in the West. And there's an increased awareness of the need for integration and integration support, because most of the long-term changes happen after the peak experience, not during the peak experience. You're going through an intense transformation, but it's what do you do with it? So preparation of these experiences in the lead up, the initiation of the experience, but then the integration is very important. But still, even within that, it's like, why are we doing this? I mean, the majority of people who are having shamanic experiences in the West aren't necessarily going for healing, where the medical psychedelic model perhaps is. And yeah, there can be great benefits. You know, there are definitely outreaches and organizations that are looking at PTSD. There's a lot of work with war veterans, you know, with psilocybin, with ayahuasca, with 5-MeO. There's definitely, you know, elements of that. But in general, this underground demographic that we have no statistics on, you know, I first went down to Peru in 2006. I asked the indigenous shamans, I said, you know, what do you think's happening? Why are the Westerners coming down here to Peru? And is it just this sense of healing? And they said, yes, but no. The majority of people were going down because they were sick, but they didn't realize they were sick in the West. They were sick because they were disconnected. They were disaffected. They didn't have a sense of meaning or a sense of connection, and that their experiences with plants and shamanic and earth medicines was reconnecting them to the world, to themselves, to each other, but to the planet itself in a visceral way, not in some airy-fairy, hippie, new age, newspeak, but in a sense which is felt, you know, in your heart, in your being, that you can feel the earth, you can feel the wind and hear the animals, and you can sense the interconnectedness of all things. And this is that part of that ego dissolving, but this sense of initiation goes beyond just a medical healing capacity. The healing capacity is almost a byproduct of opening up. And when we open up and let the mind go, some of the emotional weight and things we've been storing energetically go, and some of the physical things can be healed or let go of. But then I really question the West's vision for where this goes. What do we do with the shamanic experience? What do we do with the revelation? Or what is it doing with us, right? And I really feel that it's an initiation into an awareness of the collective consciousness of the planet. The Gaia, the planet herself, has a consciousness, that all her species and creatures are part of that interdependent consciousness, and that she's transforming rapidly now, both through human anthropogenic, carbon emissions and climate change, and through a lot of natural processes she's going through in her larger geological scales of time of the different world ages. But the world is in such rapid transformation that these experiences of the shamanic nature point towards understanding or coming into relationship with the planet more and with ourselves more. And that feels to me the biggest takeaway and the biggest thing which could change the direction of Western culture. And that's really the promise of the 60s, and what the psychedelic revolution of the 60s was to change the direction of human culture, to come back into a sustainable, equitable, utopian vision. And I don't see that happening with medical psychedelics. I don't necessarily see that happening with shamanic culture either, but I feel that is the potential of it if we were to self-organize and integrate these experiences and acknowledge the oneness we have with the earth and all the other species.
Yes, I mean, I agree with what you said. And usually, let's say if someone goes to Peru or Mexico to have such experience out of curiosity, I think in the end, he might have a very pleasant surprise to find out that he's more connected to nature, more connected to himself and with everyone around. So that could also, I think, could be a very good benefit of having this type of experience, even if is initiated as a curiosity, and that could also lead to...
What we notice is that people say, there's a whole generation and a half of people that have gone over to Peru, and I usually lead ayahuasca retreats once a year in the summer in June, down to Peru to work with my shaman who's in the book and the film Aya Awakenings, Percy Garcia. So I'm very familiar with all this, but there's a sense of camaraderie and togetherness of everyone who goes through these experiences together as groups. And then there's a larger cultural sense of belonging, which is pretty much mediated through the social media and the Facebook groups of Thank You Plant Medicine, all the different ayahuasca groups, all the different 5-MeO groups. There's a sense of community, but it's still disempowered, or it's still unanchored, because it's not a real community. It's a distributed virtual community that have had these experiences, and as part of their integration stay connected. But we're not doing, the motif for my book Aya Awakenings was Joseph Campbell's heroic journey cycle, which is essentially departure from the known world, initiation into the mystery, and then the heroic return. And in the heroic return, the initiate who's gone through the experiences and had these changes shares their energy of the person they've become with the tribe, shares their vision. And, for a large degree, the shamanic vision is that the earth is alive, it's intelligent, it's sculpting and shaping all the species. There's a sense of, oneness and interdependence with all the different species. And that vision, a lot of us have felt. I think we could agree with that. Yet what are we doing to anchor that vision? What are we doing to put that vision into motion? What are we doing to connect with others in our community or to the mainstream? So a lot of the momentum in the last decade or more has been to popularize things like ayahuasca, which has worked really successfully. It's been written up in all the mainstream media, all the major television channels, all the documentaries. Everyone's heard about it, usually for the healing, right? And so it attracts more mainstream people in. And, in the psychedelic scene, Michael Pollan released his book in 2018, How to Change Your Mind, New York Times bestselling food writer who got into psychedelics. That has brought in millions of mainstream Americans into awareness of psychedelic medicines and some shamanic entheogens like ayahuasca and 5-MeO and psilocybin. And yet, most of them are still plugging into waiting for the above ground legal psychedelic medicines, or, they're plugging in slowly into the shamanic underground. And yet there's still lacking a sense of unified vision of what we do with this. More and more new people are coming into psychedelics and entheogens. And yet the great elephant in the room, the promise of this, I feel, is that these things help us to remember who and what we really are, that we're one species amongst millions in the Gaian web, and we're all in this together, and there's a larger force which is driving it all, and that the human egoic conceit has caused the problem of history over 10,000 or so years of this downward spiral of centralization, hierarchy, inequity, money, like everything has started to go wrong because it's all about disconnection. It's all about hoarding. It's all about separation. So the ego dissolving properties of these experiences help Indigenous communities stay together and work together, and they could help us. And yet we haven't taken the next step into being real physical communities. So perhaps with all the world upheaval of corona and environmental devastation, with all the changes so rapidly happening, perhaps we have an opportunity for some type of I call it the global shamanic resurgence, but to sort of act, not just talk, to remobilize and to relocalize and to come together into communities who live on the land, who live and work together, and who take medicine together, to be part of that cohesive whole, and then to work with the planet. It really feels it's like we're becoming post-industrial, re-indigenous global citizens, with a shamanic core that is really reminding us of our connection. I mean, that is the promise of where we could go, and it's a potential.
Yeah, and like any other movement, maybe it needs a critical mass in order to move in a certain direction, and then more will join. But time will tell. And you mentioned breath work, and in a previous interview, you also said something about Kriya Yoga and how amazed you were to find that these breathing techniques were used many thousand years ago, and they're reenacted in the 19th century. I also practice Kriya Yoga, which comes down through the Babaji lineage. And nowadays we have Soma breath work. We have the breathing practices done by or during the workshops of Dr. Dispenza. How do you merge breath work in what you do, and how you see this as an element of improving ourselves and helping us on our way to enlightenment?
Well, personally, I still have to answer that one. I haven't really undertaken any large-scale training with breathwork, but when I have here and there, it just seems like a very fundamental modality to, it's our breath. It's right there. We have this opportunity. And again, it's my egoic resistance to my habits, that haven't really gotten over the hump of that. Breathwork is essential. I think this is the thing which 5-MeO led me onto more than ayahuasca, was understanding the different states of consciousness. So as well as having a full ego obliteration with 5-MeO, you can dip your toes in the water of that ocean within. You can have a smaller dosage. You can lighten the mind, lessen the mind, and activate the energy, and you can have some capacity for consciousness while going in. So, a couple of times in Mexico, I have worked in yogi pods where we've worked with pranayama, with breath work, with meditation, on light doses of 5-MeO toad, pre, during, and after, the medicine itself, to see what the variables and to experiment with the modality. And I've got to say, each and every time, breath work, before a 5-MeO experience helps calm the body down, helps calm the mind down. Breath work during the 5-MeO experience, if you still have enough capacity of mind to be functional, can totally extend and deepen the experience. And same with after you can keep it going for long. It's like, so there's a rich area of exploration, I think, and we're seeing, to a large degree, there's growing acceptance within the yogic communities of entheogens. I guess there's a lot of dogmas from the root of these traditions where, they've had resistance to the left-hand path or to psychedelics or to drugs, essentially. But if you dig back deeper, there's always an entheogen at the root of all these ancient modalities -- religions, whether that's Buddhism, whether that's, some of the Eastern traditions. They all had an entheogen, in the Vedic traditions, they had the soma. which they drank, and it made them unto gods, and was definitively an entheogenic experience. So, you know, I was really surprised and gladdened when I really have come across a lot of the teachings of the Eastern paths of breath work and of consciousness, because it really matched identically so many different states of consciousness I've experienced through entheogens themselves. And basically, they've left us maps of consciousness. And so it's really, I think, a time of unifying and of bringing together all the different modalities that if you use their maps with an entheogen, and you can do this with microdosing, right? To actually go into the space deeper. So you're actually feeling the spaces they describe. I think in the West, when we're just using our mind and we're reading a book on meditation or listening to how to meditate, the doing is the thing. And the same with breath work. When you're doing it, you're feeling it. If you can extend that with, you know, a catalyst which is really deepening your ability to feel it, and you've got structure, so you're doing something with the experience, you're activating with the entheogen, and then you're focusing with the training and the modality to do something with that potential which is awakened. That is the marriage which is going to transform everything. And that is essentially what I believe, you know, all the way back many thousands of years, potentially that's how they got these maps to begin with, because they had the soma. You know, it feels to me that this thing was taught energetically top down, and then we're left with the maps to how to, you know, bottom up, how to go back in. And people, you know, over time have forgotten the entheogenic origins of these practices. So, you know, again, this is what I mean. It's like, because we don't have really a functional shamanic community, psychedelics to a degree there's NGOs and there's organizations, and there are NGOs and organizations for entheogens around, but a lot of them are really dedicated to policy, to the integration of these substances into the Western either medical model or above ground model. But there's very few organizations which are integrating these modalities like breath work, like meditation, things like that into the psychedelic experience. They are increasing, and there's an increasing awareness of them, but pretty much, you know, different facilitators I talk to and different people that use them, this is the top shelf stack. It's like, you know, in microdosing, when people do like the Paul Stamets stack with the psilocybin and the niacin and the lion's mane, this is like the consciousness stack. When you use an entheogen with a modality and, you know, support and integration, you're stacking your ability to go deeper with the experience and to take something from it that you can utilize ongoingly, that you don't need to keep having the peak experiences, but you've found the pathways within, and then you can continue to activate those pathways with the training of the modalities. So it's really coming full circle, I think, to a very archaic understanding of like the mystery schools of antiquity, where they would work with entheogens, but they also had modalities that they would work with. And I know a few people. There's the entheogenic yogi in LA, Joel Briere, who's a good friend. He's developing a course to basically teach the 8 limb paths of yoga and all the different techniques to be integrated into the psychedelic entheogenic experience. And I really think we need more mystery schools versus just NGOs. You know, we need to really integrate these experiences beyond the peak experience. Like, what is the value? And then we need to be able to continue that relationship with the spaces that these catalysts open.
Yeah, interesting. In fact, one of my previous guests has a school of magic, and he teaches magic, and it's very interesting. On a different topic, have you spent any time with Australia's Aboriginal tribes? Because I read some very interesting stories about their mind power and telepathy and healing powers, and just unbelievable.
You know, there might be a little bit of the Western romanticization of the savage archetype in a lot of that. You know, in Australia, essentially, I mean, you know, when Black Lives Matter erupted across America, you know, to a larger degree in the last few months, and we've seen hundreds of thousands of people, you know, joining the cause, we don't have that to the same degree, anywhere near the same degree in Australia. And obviously the population sizes are different. The size of the Aboriginal communities in Australia is different. But, you know, it's this historical legacy that the the Western countries, you know, like for the last 500 years, the ones who settled, like Australia was settled essentially by the English and maybe Irish, but essentially we killed all the Aboriginals. Our ancestors killed all their ancestors, and the remnants. It's very much the sad legacy of empire that in a lot of these countries like Canada, Australia, you know, all
USA,
around where
yeah.
they're remnants, and so they're decimated people. In Australia, the Aborigines are decimated. Their cultures were decimated. The ones who survive are on reservations or land, and they're affected with, you know, drugs and addiction, and they're wounded, and they're slowly dying. So there's not a lot of existing functional or highly functional communities or individuals within that. In terms of entheogenic use, I mean, I've talked to a few elders around the Byron Bay region where I used to live, and heard a few certain things, but essentially, you know, they understand entheogenic plants. I mean, there's some discussion over the fact that they used acacias. In Australia, you know, the DMT containing acacias are very abundant. They're all through different states in Australia, and the Aborigines knew of them definitely. They may have been used in childbirth when the woman was giving birth to create a big smoke and to bring the baby in through a acacia DMT containing smoke. There's not really any existing evidence of entheogenic use by Aboriginals, you know, in recent past or in prehistory, mainly because it's an oral culture, it's not written down, and a lot of it was decimated, the elders were decimated, and also that they have a very protective culture, that there was compartmentalization of knowledge. So, you know, people that had these skills or were in that role, there was men's knowledge and women's knowledge and certain initiations. And for a lot of Indigenous people around the world, psychoactive, you know, medicines were used at stages of initiation. They weren't necessarily used like in weekly ceremonies or, you know, the community coming together. They were used very strategically for that transition, for say boys to men or different things like that. So it's hard to say, but in general, there's, you know, a perception that the Aboriginal consciousness, maybe you could say, or that ability to connect to that dreamtime consciousness, a different state than the linear state of consciousness, has been part of their legacy. And, you know, that there is a relationship with the land. I think you've got to remember that before they were, you know, put on reservations and sort of compartmentalized, they were very much entangled in this psychic relationship with the land as a living entity, and that the spirits in the land and the consciousness in the land was something they intuitively understood and would create stories about to sort of map it, and that their consciousness, not even from psychoactives, but basically from not being what we've fallen into in the last 12,000 years or so of history, since the lower Dryas near extinction event happened. We fell into agriculture very, very suddenly as a response to climate change, which, you know, decimated our ability to be the hunter-gatherers. And then from, you know, agriculture and staying sedentary and creating, you know, not being on the land and hunting-gathering, relationships with animals, the diseases that come with animals, hoarding, you know, tribes, towns, cities. There's an exponential domino effect where we've got the modern world as a response to the trauma of near extinction. But in relation to that, we have come out of relationship with the land. The land and the earth is something we just take from as we go back to our little boxes and hide away. Aboriginal and Indigenous people are of the land. And when you're on the land, there's a consciousness in the land, in the very fabric of the environment, which you have to understand to survive and be part of. So Indigenous consciousness in general, and some of the Aborigines perhaps as part of this, is different than the Western consciousness we have now in its root structure of its ability to hear the land, to speak to the land, to engage with the land, to be one with the land. And so that environmental consciousness is not something you do by signing a petition online or voting green. It's something you live and breathe in your ability to get out there and to survive and thrive and be one with Mother Earth, right? And we haven't had that for so long that we do romanticize, you know, other Indigenous cultures. Of course, there's the whole survival, you know, thing. It's not necessarily an easy life. And we're just very accustomed to this digital age that we live in. But I wonder, you know, can we relearn these old ways? We might be forced to relearn some of these old ways to survive in the near future.
Yeah, I think we can learn to live off the land and with the land in harmony, but there is no desire because our modern life gives us everything we need at our fingertips. So it's very convenient, you know, to turn on the switch or the water tap and we have everything there. So it takes, you know, a forceful event or an unexpected event for us to go back to the roots of our ancestors, pretty much. I know that
right, we're living through a planetary near extinction event is growing in its urgency month by month, week by week.
Yeah, I know that a project you put together is Terra Incognita. What can you tell us about it, please?
Well, Terra Incognita is basically wound down just through a general attrition over the years. But essentially, when I first did 5-MeO in, well, the toad medicine in 2015, you know, there was a lot of strands of evolution of realizing what does the neuroscience say about the 5-MeO experience. And, you know, neuroscience can be very complicated, as we found. We worked for about 5 years in the Terra Incognita project in sponsoring both environmentalism and conservation of the Buffalverius toad and a lot of work with that. But essentially our core drive was to promote more research into 5-MeO specifically and its role in consciousness. And there's some tantalizing possibilities. You know, we can get EEG, which is the electroencephalography scans of the brain. It's only the surface electrical activity, and it's essentially telling you what geographic regions of the brain are active at different times and with different medicines. But I mean, the goal would be for me is like, can neuroscience map what is happening on 5-MeO? A lot of the psychedelic research with neuroscience points to the fact that it's an absence of activity in the brain, which is the feeling we experience in the psychedelic experience, not necessarily an increase in the activity of the brain. It's a decrease in the activity, especially in the frontal regions and default mode network of sense processing of the external reality. So when that all falls away, the external reality, it's like the space between the beats. But, you know, my hope, and there's still, you know, research being done on 5-MeO, and there'll be more and more, although it's very much going to be targeted, like the rest of psilocybin and MDMA research, to PTSD and to trauma relief. But it's like using an atomic explosion to light a match. Like, you know, reducing the 5-MeO experience to something therapists can do in an hour or under in their you know, with their client base for relieving the anxiety, you know, it's yes, it can help with that, but actually it's connecting you to the fabric of source consciousness. It's like the hugest experience. It's very difficult to capture that. You know, the best I think the science can do is to point towards neural activity or lack of neural activity, but to create a snapshot. But essentially, there's a potential, I believe, to create a data map of what's happening with 5-MeO experience, and potentially to replicate that data map and to then imprint that data map or entrain other brains into a 5-MeO, because we know it's endogenous, we know it's in there, we know that it's reducing these areas of the brain, we know that EEG and MRI studies done on trained, you know, experienced monks and meditators, it's the same areas of the brain which are decreasing as 5-MeO when they meditate. So, you know, these things, there's a lot of technology around now which is utilizing headbands and EEG to entrain people into taking control of their states of consciousness, going from like alpha beta to you know, more calmer states. If we could marry the 5-MeO experience with those entrainment devices, then I think we could start to greatly expand this experience to a larger section of the community who might not go near entheogens themselves, but who could be entrained into brainwave research or neural feedback to elicit that same response, which we have the potential for within us. So we did a lot of research over the years, but we've currently wound down the Terra Incognita project, and there are other organizations exploring those frontiers.
Yeah. So in other words, you will mimic the brainwave, but without actually doing or inhaling the 5-MeO, correct?
Yeah, there's Jay Sanguinetti is a researcher in the States, and he's been doing a lot of work with feedback and with entrainment of the brain, and looking at ways that there's things like the Persinger, they call it the God helmet. It's like using transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is what Jay's been looking at, to activate areas of the brain and to see what the effects are on consciousness. So, as opposed to randomly tweaking different areas of the brain to see what's happening, if you can get a data map of what's happening in the 5-MeO experience and the geographies to tweak, then you could take something like the transcranial magnetic stimulation helmet and, identically replicate those areas to sort of entrain that brain consciousness into the 5-MeO state. It's what do they call it? Pie in the sky type of stuff at the moment, but it's an area of research which is very rich in potential and it just needs the funding and the vision to do that.
That's very interesting indeed. Yes. Are you working on episode 3 of Shamans of the Global Village?
Well, we were set to shoot episode 3 in Peru with a wonderful female curandera working with the San Pedro cactus in July, but of course Peru closed down with COVID-19 and everything's sort of been put on hold. So hopefully in the summer of 2021, if things open up, we'll be able to do that. We're looking at essentially what we want to do is show a diversity of practitioners, both Indigenous and Western, that have a tradition and a lineage to Indigenous teachers, and to really cover the main dozen or so entheogens across the planet. So yeah, Shamans of the Global Village is looking at, we've done 2 episodes in Mexico. Logistically, that was sort of easier and it just sort of it evolved that way. Peru, there of course is the San Pedro cactus, the ayahuasca vine, other potential medicines there. Logistically, we need to raise more money from the show and community support if we're going to get to places like Gabon in Africa to do the iboga, the root bark there, or potentially even the Amanita muscaria mushroom in Lapland or Siberia, which would be an amazing episode. But there's always challenges sort of politically around, issues of other practitioners. Is it legal in that country? Are practitioners able to be, even sometimes in countries where it's legal, like in the Arctic and with the Amanita muscaria in Lapland, there's a lot of cultural dogmas. And even though it's not illegal, a few of the practitioners don't want to be public about it. It's a difficult job to curate, bringing it together for each show and each medicine around the world, and we're really relying on community support to download Shamans of the Global Village at our .com there, and to support the show as it moves forward.
Yeah, we'll post all the links, and I know I did download the first interview. I'm going to go and do the second one as well. And Rak, we are getting close to the end of the interview. Any final thoughts?
Oh boy, we have covered a lot of ground. So everything has changed, hasn't it? 2020.
Yep.
People, could we see this coming or not? A lot of people say they saw this coming, but it's like, so essentially I feel that, the medicine community, it's difficult times. It's difficult times culturally everywhere. And it's not just coronavirus. It's the response to coronavirus has basically created conditions for an economic collapse of Western culture around the world. It's even affecting Indigenous people. Like, we can't really even go to countries like Peru at the moment because of the lockdowns. A lot of those practitioners of the medicines are really hurting. They're not financially viable. And yet, as everything's changing, there's this environmental catastrophe that we're facing on the planet. These are not disparate events. The wildfires in one area of the world, the floods in the other, the Arctic is melting. it's a closed ecosystem of a planetary being, and she's regulating the energy around. So when the Arctic ice sheet melts and the sea ice melts and the floods happen in China, and then from the floods, the plague of locusts happen, it's because everything is affecting everything else.
Yep.
So what do we do as medicine people in a transforming world? I mean, even access to the medicines is limited. So it's very challenging times we're in, and yet it's the exact times we need not just faith, we need trust, and not just in our politicians, but in ourselves. We need to feel the connection to the greater reality. We need to feel connection to the love that comes from within, from source consciousness. We need to be spiritual warriors, and to do that, that's the value of the medicines, not just for healing the symptoms that the sick culture and society has inoculated in us over time, but to go deeper, to find out spiritual truths, you know, as immortal beings and spiritual beings having a human experience, and to take risks, you know? I mean, I'm not saying take risks to wear a mask. I'm saying human civilization is turning a corner, and we need vision, we need leadership, we need connection, we need cohesion, we need each other. And the medicine experience has the potential to help us remember and to connect, and then to use that connection in the heroic return, to use Joseph Campbell's third point, to make the changes we need to make. And I don't even know if it's too late to happen through the voting booth. It's like, I really think in the years ahead, we need to have the eagle-eye vision to see what's happening on the planet, regardless of race, of country, of politics, of gender. We're all one human race, and we're in a species activation phase now, where it's, you know, as Eckhart Tolle has said, it's time to evolve or die. And
Correct.
we fall into fear, but the antidote to fear is love, and to feel that connection from these medicines, and then to come together to do something with that connection, I think is the challenge we find ourselves in the imminent time ahead.
Yeah, Rak, you're so beautifully said all this ending. The qualities you mentioned, yes, they are portraying a holistic human being, and we all have to aim to reach that that potential. So thank you very much for joining me tonight. It's been a pleasure. And for my viewers, please share this interview, subscribe to my channel, go to my Patreon account where I share exclusive information. And until next time, love and gratitude.